Welcome to Off Panel, Sketch.com's weekly podcast. This week's guest is the writer of Wayward, Figment, Skullkickers, and, well, you're pretty busy, Jim. Yeah, he's writing a lot. It's Jim Zub. Thanks for joining the show, Jim.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So, because I'm terrible, and because, as I explained to you before this podcast, I'm a bit of a fanboy of the things that the write-ups you do on your site about the economics of comics. And I don't really know what it is about them exactly, but I totally nerd out about how you take readers behind the curtain of all of your experiences. And, like, again, as I explained beforehand, some of the mad tinkering you do, which I find totally fascinating. But
well, thank you.
One of the things that I'm most curious about is, why did you decide to start doing them in the beginning?
It was sort of a weird thing. It kind of grew out of just the Twitter stuff. I mean, if your listeners don't know, practically every comic professional, like almost every major comic professional, is on Twitter now. It's just this microcosm of conversation that's happening constantly about comics, and people are saying all sorts of neat stuff, and some of them can be really quite honest about the way the business works at times. And people had asked me about, working in the business or how I write or how projects come about, all sorts of different things. And so I really, I kind of wanted to expand on some of that. And Twitter's not a good place for a long, extended, conversation. You're 140 characters at a time is not an ideal medium for this stuff. And so I started to write blog posts that really kind of, it's just about these subjects, about things like how I write a comic or how I pitch a story or things like that in order to get a project. Because I felt like it was really useful to explain to people what it was all about.
Right.
So once I started doing those, each one kind of led to another conversation, or I realized, I don't just want to say one thing about, I can't sum it all up in one post, pitching, for example. So I ended up doing, I think, 3 or 4 posts about pitching. One of them was just about sort of the mentality of, hey, don't think your life's going to change just because you sent in this pitch. And there was another about, here's a format for a pitch and sort of the mentality behind what you're trying to do. And if you're an editor, this is what they're looking at or what they're thinking about. And so that kind of stuff. And then each one kind of spiraled into, I could talk about this or I could mention that. And once people responded strongly to them, of course, that kind of gave me momentum to do more. I haven't been able to do as many this year. The majority of them came out in 2013 or early 2014.
Right.
And I would just cover different subjects. And the more I did, the more people would pass them around. And then all of a sudden it became kind of part of the, I hate using the term, right?
The brand?
Yeah, the brand. It's like, Jim Zub's a nice guy who's going to tell you things about how the business works. But it kind of inadvertently led to that, where there was an expectation of people saying, well, what do you think about this? And I go, well, I don't have all the answers, but this is what I know. And if this is helpful to you, great. And if it's not, then, well, I couldn't tell you anything else anyways, because this is what I currently know about this subject,
Right.
And I've never said that this is the only way or this is the right way or anything like that. I never want to give that impression. Mm-hmm. It's always been about, these are my experiences. This is what I've noticed. If this is valuable to you, great. And so people have responded to it really, really well. And, it's very flattering. When I go to a show, if someone brings me up a comic and they say, I started writing comics because I read your blog and this is what I made, or, I'm working on a pitch, and it was very useful for me to see an example of something, because you hear this abstraction about, well, you need to sum up your pitch or you need to get it down to a manageable amount, or, people say these things about the business, and I had these are examples. This is what they mean, or this is how it's worked for me. And it has been really helpful. The ones that are probably the most popular are the numbers ones, the economics ones. And those were a really weird thing that came about as well. The way they started is really ridiculous. So I think I was on Reddit, and they were talking about a series that had just been canceled. And I don't want to call out anyone specifically on this, but it was a creator-owned book, and their numbers were too low to keep going. Mm-hmm. And one of the posters responded with the most just bizarre-ass math I could They were basically like, well, the book has a $3 cover price and they sell 5,000 copies. That's $15,000. I don't see how they can, And I'm just like, are you insane? Like, do you not understand that you don't just, the retailers don't just like take money and hand it over to creators, the people that print the books, that ship the books, that stock the books, that the publisher, like all these people have to take their bite of the apple before you get what's left.
That'd be a horrible book. That would be a horrible business model if it was the other way.
Right. My rage essentially about that and about people's ignorance of how retail works kind of fueled that original article where I just said, okay, well, what is the amount? I know what it is because I get all the statements from Image. Mm-hmm. Here's the piece of the pie. This goes to this person and that goes to that person. And here's the real thing. And if you're printing 5,000 or less comics, guess what's left? Not much, right? Depending on how this equation sort of, it varies, but this can give you a ballpark. Mm-hmm. People reacted to it like I was saying some weird hidden alchemical formula. They were just like, what? And they could, but I think it made people really sit up and take notice and go, oh, this is why it's really important at the low end for people to support books, and why your purchase and your retailer, your pre-order at the retailer makes such a huge difference on a creator-owned book, because the difference between 5,000 copies or 5,500 or 6,000 at that low end is substantial to whether or not the book survives, because you've got to make it to digital sales and trade paperback sales and all those other things before you got to survive on a month-to-month basis, generally speaking. So that kind of honesty, I don't know, it was weird because I had friends of mine who told me, they were like, you shouldn't talk about this stuff because you don't sound like a winner, like you sound, well, people.
I understand that.
There's no other way to put it, right? It doesn't sound like you're very successful, you know what I mean? And I'm like, yeah, but that's kind of real. That doesn't mean I'm not happy or that I'm not proud of the work. It's just sometimes it's not, you're not making very much money.
Right.
And I don't know, there was this weird taboo, like, you're not supposed to say that. And I was like, come on, like, it's just the way it is, though. And so I feel, I don't know, like it doesn't smash my ego to pieces to tell people sometimes stuff doesn't work, know, and sometimes it's right to the bone. Mm-hmm. There's a point in time where we were publishing Skullkickers more because I wanted to have a book on the stands because I felt that it represented me as a creator than because it was making money. If anything, I was kind of shoveling money into a hole on parts of it. And with my understanding that we'd make it back on the trade paperbacks, we'd make it back on the digital, we'd make it back on foreign, or if all those things didn't hold true, that it was the work of Skullkickers, the complete thing, is worth more to me than, losing money for a few months or whatever on it.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the coolest things about the varying write-ups you've done is kind of, I mean, they tell a story in their own way, and they kind of tell a story of how your career has progressed. And, like, you start with the first ones you wrote involving Skullkickers, and like you said, or like the people around you said, like, are you sure you want to do that? Because, like, it paints an accurate view, but at the time, I guess, it doesn't paint a successful view, but it is cool.
Yeah, it's not financially successful.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
This is the thing, is that if you put in not to disagree, of course, but here's the thing, though. The act of having Skullkickers out there and proving that it was a quality book, regardless of sales, impressed enough editors that I started to get freelance work.
Right.
That I never would have gotten if I was just some schmo walking up to a booth and being like, I like fantasy, you know what I mean? So when I get offered Pathfinder from Dynamite, which eventually I get offered Dungeons & Dragons from IDW and Samurai Jack, and I did a Legends of the Dark Knight story for DC, and, eventually, Disney's Figment and all these different books, they come about because of the proof that I showed that I could do quality books. Mm-hmm. And that was... the money I've made on freelance work more than balances out for any losses that I could have incurred, on Skullkickers. And I'm sure if I sat, like now that the series is done,
right,
and I have all the numbers, someday when I'm feeling particularly masochistic, I will figure out exactly what that number is, right? But regardless, I can say with authority that the freelance work has more than equaled it out, let alone a body of work that is now my calling card. And so, which isn't to say that everyone should do a book until they're in debt, you know what I mean?
Right.
Or that every book you should do, flog it, flog the dead horse or whatever. A funny little anecdote. I was at Image Expo, the first Image Expo, when they were celebrating 20 years of Image.
Mm-hmm. The one that was the con, not like the actual...
The convention one, yeah. And I really wanted to go because, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Image Book, and Edwin and I both went out there to California and did Image Expo, and all the founders are there, and they have this, they have all the public stuff, but then there were a bunch of parties and social stuff, and you're literally hanging out with, like, kind of comic royalty from the 90s, and all these guys telling anecdotes, and we're all on the same team. It was really, really wonderful, socially speaking. And I had this crazy aside where I'm at one of the events, and I'm talking to Robert Kirkman. Mm-hmm. And he says to me, he goes, I really like you, and you've got a lot of, verve, and you're very vocal, and, you remind me a bit of me. But he goes, I don't know why you're still doing Skullkickers. He's like, I know financially it can't be making money for you. Mm-hmm. Like the minute, a book didn't make money for me, I moved on to the next thing. You know what I mean? Like, and he did, Tech Jacket and Battle Pope.
Yeah.
All these books that were like, they didn't do badly, but they were just like, okay, the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. And he said, that's how I did it, And he says, you just seem to be stuck on this one thing. And I said, no, it's working in its own way. And he's like, well, more power to you. I just, I think you should, seriously consider, wrap it up and get to it. And it's like, it feels weird because you're talking to a guy who is unbelievably successful.
Right.
And he's giving you advice off the cuff. And I'm kind of like, that's cool. I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but I am doing other stuff, and I was doing other freelance work, and I was making my way. And maybe it's not the most efficient, or maybe it wasn't perfect, but I still felt like it had value for me to take it to the finish line the way I wanted to.
Right.
And wrap it up in the way that I had planned from the beginning. Mm-hmm. That was sort of... I don't think I would ever do that again. I don't think if I did another creator-owned book and it hit those low numbers that I would just be like, damn the torpedoes, let's just keep going. But because of its nature as my first kind of breakout creator-owned book, and because of where I was at in my career at that point, it still seems like the right thing to do, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and I wasn't trying to imply that like you shouldn't have done anything or anything like that.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I was definitely. I was just. I think it's fascinating how the write-ups you've done have kind of paralleled your career arc, and like you can actually see. I think that's part of the reason why they catch on is because like it comes from a very realistic view to like the whole time. And it shows like the progression from like again perceived lack of success with the creator-owned project to like where you're at with Wayward now, which is like you're making money off of it. But I think one thing that it would be impossible to find in actual like tangible numbers or anything like that. I do think it's like one of the things from Skullkickers that I think people that I've talked to find to be impressive is the fact that like You did it. You actually told the entire story when like other people might have just killed it and just not let it like run its whole path. And like that dedication to it meant that not only would readers be invested in it and you're invested in it. So like that, I guess that in my mind might help readers not only be invested in that book, but also your books going forward because they know that you're dedicated to the stories you're telling. Right.
And that's not to say that I think that everyone should hunker down on a book and do it no matter what. Like everyone's threshold's got to be different, whether it's your financial threshold or your creative threshold or whatever you want to call it. I've never said, and this holds true with the advice as well, I did it this way, so you have to do it this way. You know what I mean? And I don't think that's what Robert was saying either. It was just sort of like a difference of approach and, stuff like that. So you sort of, I always try and temper it with, this is what I'm doing. This is how I'm justifying it. Your mileage may vary.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, the other thing that doesn't show up on any of those charts is like convention sales and the type of outreach we were doing online or stuff like that. And so you could look at the diamond numbers and you'd be like, I don't know about this thing. But when you put all the aggregate together, it was like, I can sell that book at conventions. I could hand sell that thing really strongly. You know, I'd go to a show like Gen Con, which is the big role-playing game fantasy Dungeons and Dragons show, and I just moved boxes and boxes and boxes of Skullkickers because it has that kind of irreverent RPG sort of feel, and it feels like the Dungeons and Dragons session that's gone off the rails. And you look at gaming books and they're very expensive, and our first trade paperback's $10, and so I could just move those suckers at a show like Gen Con, and that's all. I mean, it's not off the books. I know what's going on, but it doesn't reflect itself on a sales chart. You know what I mean? And so same kind of thing with the hardcovers, those deluxe hardcovers. They did okay in the direct market, but they've been like killer for me on the road, because if someone is a fan and they get it from me in person and they get it signed, that nice hardcover deluxe, A, that's like cash in the hand, and B, they get something really special.
Right.
You know? And so these are the kinds of calculations that are, they make it a lot more complicated than just like, oh, you're off the top 200 of the diamond chart or 300 or whatever. You don't matter, you know?
Well, and that's the marketplace is so much different than it probably was in the past, just because, like, you know, for a creator-owned book, you have single issue sales, you have trade sales, and then you like graduate to like hardcovers, like you were doing, and then you have con sales, and you know, foreign licensing, and then I guess like
licensing is like this weird hidden gem,
right? Yeah.
You know, John Layman loves telling me every time I see him, I swear he tells me they got to, chew in another language or whatever.
Yeah.
That is just like you hand over the files, and a foreign company is going to do the translation, do the printing, do the advertising, do the distribution on it, and cut you a check.
Yeah.
And so every time you get another language, I'm not talking like, change your life money, but certainly, pretty amazing when you consider that the work's done.
Right. Well, it's another place. It's another revenue stream, and like you said, the work's done. So it's not like you're having to do a lot more. It's just, you're making a deal that like not only expands your potential audience, but it also expands your revenue streams. And like I've talked to John and Rob about that several times, and I think it was funny when I did the podcast with John before. I think it was like the day after they made a deal to like release Chew in Poland, and I was like, "Holy crap! It's in Poland!"
Right?
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
It's pretty amazing stuff. And so we've gotten. I think we're in 2 languages with Skullkickers. I think it's like, I can't remember the other one. Italian, I think. And so, and I was talking to the foreign sort of rep at Image, and she felt like even though the series wasn't like a world beater, now that it was done, they could sell it more easily as a block. That there's 6 trade backs or 3 hardcovers. It's about the fact that she could take it in certain markets now and say, this is the thing we've got. This guy's other book is on the rise, and get on board kind of thing. And so that's cool. And obviously it all kind of, hopefully over the long haul, it just, I wouldn't say evergreen, but if people like Wayward or people like Samurai Jack or other things that I'm doing, and they want to track back and see what else I've done, for sure, The number of people I talk to at conventions who come to me with a Samurai Jack book or a Dungeons and Dragons book, and then I say, this is Skullkickers, this is the thing that got me the gig. Oh, really? And they're in, like that's the sale right there.
I do think it's really interesting because you told me before, and you mentioned it earlier also, but you told me before when we were I was doing a social media article about how people come up to you fairly regularly and say that they discovered your work through the blogs that you're doing, which I find to be really fascinating. But it does show that, like, once your brand gets out there, then people can start discovering your work through a lot of different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. It's got to be true. Like, it's got to be you. You can't just, right. I don't know. The blog stuff and all that, or the way I'm interacting with people online. I mean, it's obviously a facet of me.
Right.
the branding thing, you've always got to be like adjacent to reality. Like I if I had to describe like Jim Zub online, Jim Zub on Twitter, he's a pretty optimistic guy who's kind of scrappy and doing the best he can, and he kind of gives you a peek behind the curtain, and he's really energetic, and he makes these entertaining books, and he's a little bit funny, and every so often you get a sense he's a little beat down, but he's going to keep at it. And it's like, that is all me.
Right.
The beat down part is probably like, I get way more, frustrated or I have more difficulties, but those aren't necessarily for public consumption. Like, okay, let's go out with friends and kind of get that off my chest rather than, megaphone online or whatever. So there's always elements you're going to hold back. You can't always, on 100% you. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
But it's enough there, and it's adjacent and I guess aspirationally me, for lack of a better term.
One of the things that I think is, like I've mentioned the tinkering you do, but I do think it's really interesting how you've, like for Skullkickers, you did the number ones in the like the uncanny Skullkickers and things like that, and that actually did impact sales.
I'll be honest with you, it essentially kept us alive, because if you look at the sales numbers on the third arc, they're dipping to the point where the fourth arc is kind of not financially worth doing. Mm-hmm. We were right on the borderline, and it was like, okay, do we wrap up the whole thing in arc 4, or do we keep it going? And I had this, Marvel and DC were doing their big reboot stuff, and it had become this talking point, and my more sarcastic side had taken hold. And I was with friends, and I just said, well, clearly what I need to do is just do a new number 1 every month. That'll solve everything. And everyone laughed. And then I think later, and I go, I've got a comedy book. It's not totally out of the realm of possibility. Uh-huh. And then I kind of threw the idea out to Image. And I'll be honest, they weren't crazy about it. They were a little kind of unsure. There's one thing to make a joke, and then there's another thing to kind of really run with it for 5 months and see what the result's going to be. And I said, if we're going to do this, like, we got to do 5 press releases, we got to do 5 reveals, like all those things you would do for a number 1, we got to do. Mm-hmm. Just hold to the line on this thing, mm-hmm. so that it gets more ridiculous the longer we do it. Yeah. And the first couple months, first month, people went bonkers. They thought it was funny. Mm-hmm. Second month, pretty funny. Third month, they're like, you're not as funny as you think you are. And then it's like we had a dead cat bounce. Like 4 and 5, people loved it. Like they were like, they're not letting go. I wonder if this will never end. Like, and to the point where when we finally went back to the regular number, people were like super sad. I got like tons of mail where people were like, oh, this I can't believe you didn't keep it going for another 20 issues or something. And I was just like, oh my God, like, cool. And even now, even people that have never read the book, they still bring it up as, oh, you did that thing. that like uncanny thing. Probably the best advertisement we ever got was the day that Uncanny Skullkickers came out. Total coincidence. A bunch of the Marvel books had been delayed. Their mm-hmm. schedules were all over the place. They were having real trouble shipping on time. And a bunch of them synced up. And the day that Uncanny Skullkickers number 1 came out, Uncanny X-Men came out, Uncanny Avengers came out, and oh my God, there was another one. There was like 3 Uncanny books at Marvel, and then our book. And they all were on the stands the same day. And people were just shooting photos of it because it just looked like I was just urinating on them. Like I had perfectly synced this up to just take the piss, Mm-hmm. And people couldn't, like, someone said, like, how did you do that? And I just went, oh, like, that was not me. Like, the stars were in perfect alignment on that sucker. I had no, and the great thing is that whenever there was a review of X-Men that week, they said, also Uncanny this week is Skullkickers, so we got a bunch of a boost off that, like nobody's business. And that kind of reinflated the book for a while, so that as we did our natural attrition again, it was like the halfway point. Right. So we basically got back to our original first arc numbers and then drifted down again, to the end. And so that reboot trick made it possible, essentially, to finish the series.
I love the idea that people thought you were some sort of like puppet master, like controlling Marvel's.
I tell Marvel how to distribute their books. I really made sure they hit their dates.
It would totally help me out if you guys dropped X-Men and Avengers on the same day as this, because then we could have this uncanny.
Because I'm making fun of you, so it would be great if you guys could help me with this task. No, it was ridiculous. We had a ton of fun with it, and the Marvel guys really took it in good stride. A whole bunch of them, when those books were coming out, came over to my booth and they thought it was very fun and very cheeky, and they've always been very cool about that kind of stuff when we would do it. Mm-hmm. It's not like I'm any threat to them. Right. I'm not eating up their numbers. So, it's just everyone they kind of realize. And I think they all know, with the marketing of the new number ones and all that, it's a bit of a, it is a bit of a media kind of, keep your eye on the ball kind of stuff. You're constantly trying to reinvigorate the audience or convince them that this is the newest, greatest thing. And that's the easiest way to do it. So once it works, they just kind of hit that button, and to the point now where the 5 reboots that we did almost seem tame now compared to the current market. Right. Books don't even get to 2 digits before they're just whap, they do it again. Yeah. Howard the Duck, the ads are making fun of its reboot, Yeah. And so did Squirrel Girl. And I'm just sitting there laughing like, wow, you guys can't even, say this with a straight face anymore. Yeah. I do think that and then like something like where you serialized all of Skullkickers online. Like I thought those were really interesting moves, but and it's still going now. Yeah. Well, and I know you've said you did a blog post on it talking about how I think it was like 90 times the readers that had read the comic had read it in digital, which is incredible. But it also makes sense given how people work. But sure. Free is a pretty enticing number. Oh yeah, people love free. It's incredible. But did you find that with Skullkickers, because where you were with it, that you could kind of take risks with that you probably wouldn't like these days with like Wayward, for example? What do you mean by that? So like, with Skullkickers, you'd serialize it online and you would like do those reboots or anything like that. But I don't imagine you would do that with Wayward, where your formula is working really well, it's also the nature of the book. Skullkickers is a sarcastic book. It's a humor book. Mm-hmm. It lends itself to a certain amount of kind of, especially the later story arcs where we start getting into kind of archetypes of fantasy storytelling, and we kind of riff on how stories are made, essentially. And so we could get away with stuff in the context of the book where it felt like it was, like it fit still in a way that if I started getting really cheap, we did one joke cover for Wayward. We did one of the Phantom retailer cover. Mm-hmm. And so it's Ayane and Rory, and they're kind of looking at the reader and giving them the thumbs up. And it says, from the team that hopes to be half as successful as Saga and Sex Criminals. And it said it like in this, the big font, so that if you glanced at it, you'd like, oh, Saga and Sex Criminals, and then you'd pick it up. Uh-huh. And that was sort of a one-off we did as a joke, because the retailer group, the guy that runs that, he likes the humor covers, and we did a Skullkickers sort of joke cover with him, and he really loved it. And so he said, I want to do a joke cover. And I was like, okay, for the first issue, I think we can get a little tongue-in-cheeky or whatever, but it's not a regular thing that we do. It's not in the context of the book, sort of how we think. And so part of it was having the freedom of, well, screw it, it's Skullkickers. The worst we can do is get some press, whereas with Wayward, if you're doing a serious drama and then all of a sudden start making fart noises, it doesn't work, it's not the same kind of book. So, and it's not like I've mastered this thing. Like, as much as Wayward's doing very well right now, I don't have a crystal ball. I try never to take for granted our readership or the loyalty that we're building. I don't know where we'll be by the end of Arc 3. I'd like us to continue to be stable. I would be ecstatic if we grew. thanks to the solid trade paperback sales and people not wanting to wait because the story is hopefully, engaging enough that they want to get on board the monthlies.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. And so it's all a work in progress for me when I look at what's happening and when I sit down with my co-creators and they trust me to sort of captain the ship on Wayward, and this is our schedule and this is how we're going to do it. But I try and be honest with them that it's all a work in progress, that, it works right now and I hope it continues to do so. But we're going to find out,
Yeah. Well, so talking about like kind of the more traditional elements of like, developing your audience for a book. I know that you're really, one of the big things that you do is you reach out to retailers and you build a network and you build relationships and everything like that.
Right.
And having spoken to a lot of retailers over the years, I know that that's something that's impactful to them. That's something that they hope to see.
To be crass, the Diamond Distribution's customer is the retailer.
Yeah.
They hope that they can then resell those books, because they're on a non-returnable basis the majority of the time, to their customer base. But if the retailer won't order the book and put it on the stands, no one's going to stumble across it. No one's going to discover it.
Right.
You know what I mean? Which is why pre-orders are so important, but also getting retailers to trust you and to be able to sell, to convince them that this is worth their time. And that, when I think about the fact that they look through a catalog just jam-packed with stuff every single month, like the previous catalog is this labyrinth of pop culture death.
It's so insane.
Madness, right?
Yeah.
And then with all the ordering incentives and the variants and the craziness, I would just be a gibbering madman if I had this thing every month, right? But not only do they have to do that, they've got world-beating brands, billion-dollar movies like the Avengers or Superman or stuff in there, alongside. Like there's no other industry that works this way. It's imagine if you were ordering music for a music store and in the exact same catalog as U2, they had like a garage band down and you're like, that's on page 20. Like, it's weird, man. It's really weird. And so I have to convince you that the money you invest in me and in Wayward is going to get you what you deserve alongside Conan and Transformers and The Walking Dead.
Right.
You know what I mean? And that's kind of insane that we can even attempt to do that, let alone successfully carve out a stable readership.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one of the main reasons why they appreciate like people reaching out to them. It's like one of the things I've heard from them. Like I know that timeliness is hugely important to them.
Oh, massive.
And it seems like I've talked to some retailers who have said that like creators will like reach out to them and say like we've already got like 4 issues in the can, and like that makes like a huge difference to them. But
inadvertently, when a retailer is selling a book to a new reader, it's also weirdly kind of their reputation that they're putting on the line when they say this creative team is good, this book is great, you gotta watch this. If that book stops coming out on time, or that book's dead on arrival, then the next time they recommend a book, maybe someone will be like, I don't know.
Right.
So it's their reputation that you're playing with as well. You know what I mean? Let alone if a retailer does one of those incentive covers or something where they make a special cover for their store, they've essentially said, this is a destination for this item, for this. Right. We're putting our deep investment into this as a future purchase that we think we can build a really substantial readership here for X. And so I don't want to take that for granted. I don't want to treat them like faceless entities, because they're not even a chain of stores. These are individual stores almost to a T,
Yeah.
And unfortunately, you've got to win over them almost on a case-by-case basis. Whereas if it was just like Walmart or something, you got to convince the buyer to order 20,000 units or something crazy across X number of stores. Here, I got to fight for shelf space in every town, in every little mom and pop shop. But if I do that and I do it successfully, it gets easier and easier.
Yeah. Do you think that your work in like reaching out to retailers has been one of the? I mean, I'm not going to say it's like the biggest reason or anything like that, because the quality of the books. If you weren't putting out good quality of books, you're not going to make.
Well, that's the thing. As you know, all this other stuff. I think sometimes I forget how. I think Eric Larson was talking about this, and he said it's kind of maddening where people will always ask him about, like what pencils he uses or and that's the question he gets 90% of the time. And then 10% of the time they're like, how much time do you spend drawing? Like, the real important thing is the books have to be good. You can do all the outreach in the world. You can be the nicest person at conventions. You can do all that stuff. But if the books aren't good, if they're not consistent, and if they're not entertaining or hitting the mark on what you're trying to sell, then all of it's kind of for naught. You're, they'll just be like, oh, it's a real shame that such a nice person puts out such dreck. Your mother will tell you it's good or whatever. But and so it's got to kind of go hand in hand, that if I'm saying something to a retailer, I've got to follow through on that commitment. If I tell them this is Buffy in Japan and Wayward's like this and this is how it feels and this is why, they then have to carry that to their customers in the same way,
right?
And tell them that thing and trust in it, that we're going to deliver the goods. So, well, but I think it is a big part of a strategy if you're talking about retail. Yeah. I don't think it's for everyone. I don't think mainstream comic book shop sales are the promised land for every series at every publisher. When you look at web serialization, when you look at Kickstarter, when you look at all these other avenues that are available to people now, I think you need to be pretty careful about picking your battles, about where is the right fit for it. You look at some of the biggest web comics, and they could never have found a publisher originally.
No.
XKCD, which is like stick figures talking about science. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people, read this comic, but you could never take that to a publisher. They would laugh you right out of there. Dinosaur Comics, Ryan North's doing a book where they literally have clip art, the same art, and it's the dialogue that's funny. And if you read it over time, you realize how incredibly intelligent Ryan is and how funny he is and how nuanced his use of language and timing is. But the reason why people read that the comic, is because it was free and it kind of grows on you. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Over time, you realize that if someone just handed you this thing and you said, "What? It's just the same art on every page," forget it. You're out of here. You're a crazy person. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, reading that like years later, and having the exact same art, because it's in Anchorage, Alaska. We have this weekly paper called The Press. And it's in every single issue. And
cool.
For the first while, I didn't really even it didn't register in my head because I'd read it infrequently. It didn't even register that it was the same art every time. And then when I was reading,
Ryan can't draw.
Yeah. And then when I realized it made me laugh really hard, because I was like, the art is the same every time. This is even funnier now.
Oh, totally. And the fact that the jokes work and the timing works and the giving himself that structure ends up becoming the thing, right?
Yeah.
But Ryan's really smart and he's very funny and he's very capable. And now he's done, Adventure Time and Squirrel Girl and all this other stuff because he's proven himself as a writer. Mm-hmm. There was a time when webcomic serialization was like this to the regular publishing industry. It was a ghetto of vanity publishing. Oh, you couldn't make it in the real world, so you better put it on the internet,
mm-hmm.
And over time, people have realized that back to what we were saying before, branding or audience building is more valuable than even having a big name necessarily behind it. So, I'll be at conventions and I'll pitch my books and people will be really excited and they'll be like, "Oh, where can I find these?" And I go, "We're published by Image, the guys that do The Walking Dead." And they're like, "What?" That was not even an issue for them. They were willing to buy no matter what because of the pitch, because of the art, because of the concept. They're not like, "Well, I only buy from publisher X." That's not the way people are looking at it nowadays. It's, if it's on the web and it's good, then it's good and you share it with your friends. And if it's crappy, then you don't read it anymore. And that's kind of the bar is the quality rather than just where you're finding it.
Yeah, I remember talking to Rick Burchett. I think I pronounced that right at Emerald City Comic Con a couple years back, and it was shortly after the Lady Saber Kickstarter. I don't know if you're familiar with that book that he did with Greg Rucka, and I remember talking to him about it as he was signing my book, and he was saying he was just like, I've never had a comic that was read by millions of people.
Right.
And it's cool because he, like, you know, you go from that and then you go into the Kickstarter, and like their Kickstarter just totally crushed. And it's really awesome. Like I talk about it a lot on the podcast and on the site, but I just love that, you know, there's a lot of hemming and hawing that goes on about the direct market, but there's so many different ways to succeed in comics and so many different routes that I think it's such an exciting time for comics just for that reason.
A lot of the assumptions about where books need to be found or what a professional quality comic looks like or particular place is no longer the case, and we're finally over that hump where retailers were so terrified of digital comics and they thought that, you know, the sky was falling and it was going to destroy them all. And we've seen print sales bounce, and we've seen books and bookstores are back because people just want good books. And if anything, it's the equivalent of watching a TV series and then buying the DVD box set, right? So people will buy trade paperbacks of stuff that they could read for free online.
Right.
People will support a Kickstarter because they feel passionate about the attachment they have to a particular thing. It's no longer just a simple, well, they're stealing it, you're doomed, you know, kind of thing, like it used to be. Like, it doesn't thrill me to see Wayward, you know, being torrented like crazy. But the fact that if 1% of those people were to buy the book, it would make a huge difference to our bottom line. But by the same token, there is growth there.
Did you ever see Steve Lieber? He his book with Jeff Parker, Underground, was like it was out on 4chan, and he went, instead of like being like, oh, rage, he went and talked to the people on there and like shared a link to buy the book, and it ended up like spiking his sales way more than, like, for example, they had an article that was on Boing Boing about the book, and the comparison was like something like 20 times the lift in sales just from that 4chan interaction.
I don't think it's a simple equation, but there's no one answer. That's the key there, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The funny thing is Skullkickers is still serializing online, and we're about like 5 months back from where the book is physically. So we're done. The book has been finished for a month and a half, but we've still got content that's going to run on the website until March 2016. And it's all preloaded. The book, the website is going to run it, like, not, you know, knock on wood, if I die, the website's going to update till March 2016. It's all ready to go. So I don't even have to think about it. It's on autopilot. And I can tell, you know, because people come to my table and they're telling me about, quote, the current storyline, and it's, you know, the web. Like, I know that that's what they're talking about. They're not talking about the last issue. They're not talking about the ending.
Right.
They're talking about what they're reading online. And I point to the trade paperback of the final story, and they're like, that's it? That's the one? Yeah. Oh, okay, I'll buy the one before that. I want to read it online. I want to read it as it comes out. I don't want to ruin it for myself. And I'm like, cool. And then they're like, and then I'll buy the final one from you, or I'll buy it off Amazon or whatever. And it's like, great, man. Like, whatever works. I'm not going to worry about it. You're a fan. You're a reader. You know, that's what really matters at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, I found it to be pretty interesting, like the different routes people take, because, like, you know, I'll read a book online, like on Marvel Unlimited, for example, and then I'll buy, once I realize I love this, I'll buy like an omnibus collecting all of it or something like that. And it is kind of cool how, like, you can come from so many different paths as a reader, and it can lead to, like, buying those collections, because, I don't know, like, people engage with entertainment in a lot of different ways these days, and it makes sense that it would happen in comics too.
Especially if they feel like there's a bond there. And that's where stuff like the social media can get really interesting, because when people are reaching out and they're telling you they like something, or they're asking you about it, they, you know, and if you can give them a response, you know, and if you can be genuine, like they don't know you, but you know what I mean, that there's some sort of contact there. then it puts them in a positive frame of mind to support you, right?
Mm-hmm.
When they read these blogs, like you said, the narrative of watching my sales charts and then saying, well, that guy seems like a really good guy and he works really hard and he's always, well, I'm just going to buy that book, you know?
Yeah.
And hopefully you really enjoy it. And then you're like, well, I'm going to buy all of his books or whatever. Like, that's part of the, and it's not a strategy. It's not like I sit around steepling my fingers. Oh, got them now, you know, like, but that's the reality of how this stuff sort of works. That, you know, so I've got whatever, 12,000 Twitter followers. I don't know 12,000 people in person, but there's 12,000 people who are in some form or another, barring bots, listening to what I'm saying every so often. Mm-hmm. And like, I'm not always talking about the work, but I'm talking about the work quite a bit. And at some point, maybe you just finally go, all right, I've heard enough. I'm in, I'll try it. You know? Mm-hmm. I feel confident that the work will speak for itself and hopefully you'll stick around. You know, and so it's a weird thing because it, like, on a conscious level, I know that's happening, but I'm engaging people because I genuinely enjoy it. Mm-hmm. Like, obviously the undercurrent is, hey, it'd be great if you bought my book, but I'm talking to you because I like the conversation, or I'm talking to you online because I like the interaction, or I appreciate the time we're spending. Mm-hmm. It gets more difficult the more work you're doing. You know, you can't be everywhere, as I'm realizing, you know. I did a lot of conventions this year. I did a lot of outreach online, and it is time spent. And the time you're spending online and the time you're spending on the road is not time getting work done. And it's also not time spending with your loved ones or, you know, your friends or your quiet time or your personal space or any of those things. And so you've got to try and find a balance in that whole crazy tornado of stuff, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, don't you also teach?
I do. So I have a day job, which kind of, I think a lot of people have the assumption that, well, if you're doing conventions or you're doing an image book or if you've done Marvel work, you must be fully gainfully employed doing comics. A lot of people in this business are transitioning creatives, you know what I mean? That is not their full-time job. The number of full-time, I think Ron Mars actually said it in a really cool way at one point. He said there are probably less, like, really well-off, you know, like, people, full-time comic people than there are, like, professional baseball players.
Yeah.
You know? And which is, when you think about it, he's probably right.
He probably is.
For sure. And so you're like, oh, God. He's like, yeah, it's a pretty rarefied air to be making a gainful living just on comics. Almost everyone is kind of scrappily doing multiple things, whether they're doing other writing or they're doing freelancing or of various types. They're wearing a bunch of different hats. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so my background's in animation, and I did work in Canadian animation for several years. And then I transitioned into working at the Udon studio, and I was an artist and then a project manager there. So there was two parts to the Udon studio. There's publishing, which is where you get the Street Fighter comics and a lot of their art books and things. And then there was what's called creative services, which is like doing concept art for video games or advertising art for whatever, everything from games to toys to comics to just pop culture, anything. We were doing RPG books and all kinds of stuff. And so I was overseeing that element of the company. And so it was a hodgepodge. You'd work on a Hollywood movie this month. The next month you'd be doing spot illustrations for a storybook. And then you'd be doing advertising artwork for a video game. And you had to be really kind of thinking on your feet. Mm-hmm. So while I was doing that, an opportunity came up to start teaching part-time at an art college in Toronto. And this whole time I wasn't doing my own comics. This is before Skullkickers. I had done some online comic stuff, but I wasn't for myself, but I wasn't doing regular comic gigs. And the longer I kind of dug into all this freelance stuff and then eventually teaching, the further I was getting away from being a storyteller, which is my real passion, what I want to do. I want to, in this case, write comic books. But I learned a ton. I learned a ton as a teacher. I learned a ton when I was project managing. The reason why I can keep my creator-owned stuff on schedule and make sure that it's working properly and have a method for building this stuff is because of everything I learned as a project manager at Udon. Mm-hmm. I learned how publishing works. I learned how advertising works. I learned graphic design, like the design of the Skullkickers and the Wayward books, like the actual trades and our logo and all the trade dress. I'm the designer on the book because I'm too cheap to pay someone. And I learned how to do that stuff. When people tell me, oh, the books are beautiful, I want to hire your graphic designer, I'm like, I'm not for sale. Like,
I'm too busy.
I do this out of just sheer skinflintness, like I don't want to pay someone, and I'm very specific about what I like. But when push came to shove, and this was a few years ago, the school stuff, the teaching is very consistent. There's a consistent paycheck there. I know exactly what I'm going to make. And I know once you've taught a course several times, you have a curriculum and you make changes to it. But once you have that structure in place, it gets easier and easier to teach the same classes. Do you know what I mean? So when I looked at it and I said, of all the things I'm doing, teaching is very, very stable. And that's a good bedrock for my sort of financial stability if I'm going to be reaching out into this very tumultuous industry of comics.
Yeah.
And I love teaching. I love interacting with the students, and I love being able to bring my experiences into the classroom. And it makes me a better public speaker, and it makes me when you have to explain things to people and try and get concepts through to them, you learn how to speak well and how to clearly, delineate your ideas.
Yeah.
Learn from your mistakes. This is a clearer way of delivering this concept than that.
Yeah.
And you become better and better at communicating. And storytelling is about communication. So I feel like it's all kind of relative. Being a teacher has made me a better writer. It's made me a better person, and it's kept me in touch with kind of the enthusiastic side of myself when I was very young and unsure and just exuberant about the possibility of working in a creative field. Mm-hmm. And when I'm interacting with these students and they are so excited and they are so exuberant and they are so energized by the movies that they see and the books that they read and the art that they're creating, that energizes me. It reminds me about why I should be happy doing what I do.
Yeah.
And so that's why, above and beyond everything else, I don't feel like it's like a burden. Like, it's not like I go to work and I'm trudging along. There are difficult days. I mean, every job is difficult. But teaching for me has been a real boon. And then on top of that, the school really likes the fact that I'm doing these things. We have a really great agreement where they know I'm doing a bunch of freelance work. They get to brag that I did a book for Disney.
Mm-hmm.
Get to brag that I've done work for Marvel, that I wrote a Batman story, all this stuff. And so it looks good on them and it looks good on me. And we're able to sort of balance it out so that if I've got to leave a little early for a convention weekend, we can schedule a makeup class. Or
mm-hmm.
if there's a problem, we can figure it out. And so it's about that relationship that I built up with the school and with an understanding that this benefits us kind of collectively as well.
Yeah, that's really awesome. And I have to imagine it also enhances your understanding of everything you're talking about because my wife watches a lot of science shows, and there's this one guy on one of the shows that she watches. I don't know his name, but I call him fake Carl Sagan because he kind of looks like Carl Sagan. And
amazing.
He's so enthusiastic about it, and he explains these really complex ideas in such simple ways that it makes the whole thing, like you were saying, the energy is fantastic to it. And I don't know, I mean, I feel like he's explained these things so many times that he's refined his own
right
appreciation and vision for his form, which is science, versus
right.
storytelling for you.
Yeah. But that's the cool thing about it is, when you're up in front of that class, you've got to have a plan, and you have to be able to speak clearly and think on your feet, and they're going to ask you questions you've never gotten before, or they're going to look at problems in ways you've never imagined, and you need to be able to roll with that. And it's not even about being perfect.
Right.
One of the most valuable lectures I had very early on in my teaching career, didn't go well. I was doing a drawing demonstration and it was clearly not working. And you could cut the tension with a knife, right?
Right.
I stop and I just go, okay, we got to start over because this just didn't work out. Sometimes that's how it goes. And I crumple up the paper and we start again. And it's like the whole room exhaled. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, good, he knew that was crap. Like, that this guy thought he was, what did he think he was doing, right? And my ability to kind of laugh it off and start over was like a permission. Look, we're not perfect. Look, we make mistakes. Look, let's do it over again. And the whole attitude in the room changed. Like, A, this guy's a human being. That's cool. And B, he's not full of himself or just, ignoring reality, for the sake of his ego or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I learn all the time like that, and it's not like I obviously want to embarrass myself, but if you can roll with that kind of stuff, or if someone can ask you a question you don't have the answer to and you say, I don't know, but I'm going to find out and then we'll talk about this,
right? Rather
than trying to be omnipotent up at the front of a class,
Yeah.
It makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference in terms of how people treat you. And I think that kind of attitude carries through with stuff like the blog or stuff like my interactions with people at conventions where, they're getting a piece of kind of real me, and I'm not perfect and I don't have all the answers, but I'll pluckishly keep plugging away and try and build something cool.
Yeah. So before we go, I want to talk about your current creator-owned book, Wayward. It's a book I'm really enjoying. I actually just reread it, the first two trades, because they actually just came out in a hardcover. I think it was last week, wasn't it?
Yeah, we did a deluxe. And it's a real beauty. It's like over 300-page hardcover collection of the first two arcs, plus like 70 pages of back matter. So covers, variants, and sketches and character development stuff, and essays on Japanese mythology and culture.
You just dropped the first hardcover. How is that project going? I mean, I know that your most recent blog write-up talked about how it's, been doing better than Skullkickers was, financially speaking, but how are you feeling about it now in between your arcs?
Well, it's weird, because we're in between in terms of release, but production is well underway. So we're like halfway through production on the third arc already. So I'm deep into the third arc right now, production-wise. So it's a totally different mindset for me. It's good. Wayward is the hardest thing I've ever written because it's based in a real location, and we've got a real ensemble cast of characters, and so we've got a lot of different kind of moving parts. And I'm trying to do dramatic action. We've got this historical element and this, mythological element all tying into this real location. And so it's a lot of work. I find scripting an issue of Wayward is about twice as long as any other thing I've ever written. But that's a good thing. That's like a good challenge for me. It's pushing me to do things I've never done. And I feel like I'm growing as a storyteller because of it. And even if, I think it's going well and people respond really strongly to it, but I feel like it's the book where I can take risks and we can do big things. And even if it failed, I could look back and go, I'm really glad I did that because I'm going to, I'm learning so much being a part of it and building it.
Yeah. Well, and I think the depths that you get into in that book are really interesting because it's not just, you have your stuff, all the different yokai things that are going on, and it's all obviously research, but you also have Zach Davison's back matter, which I think is fantastic.
So getting Zach on board was really quite a coup because he wasn't originally part of the creative team when we started. The Image had sent out the press release, and we had announced that we were doing this book called Wayward, Buffy in Japan. It's got yokai in it. And a friend of mine, Brandon Seffert, the guy that does Witch Doctor for Skybound, and he dropped me a line, and he said, you've got to meet this friend of mine. His name is Zach Davison. He's a professional Japanese language translator, and he's a monster scholar. He's literally written books on Japanese legends and ghosts. And
that's awesome.
And I had originally thought that I would need to hire like a bunch of different people and kind of hodgepodge stuff together from Wikipedia and online sources and ask people for permission but all of a sudden I had this like one-stop shop of this knowledge base. And Zach The funny thing is that Zach was actually really kind of cold at first when I contacted him. Brandon enthusiastically set up this, email introduction.
Mm-hmm.
And Zach seemed kind of detached because what I found out later, he gets asked all the time to do stuff, not like this specifically, but, where Japan stuff's involved.
Right.
And his kind of stamp of approval is sort of like, no, it's legit. But people will bring him really, really corny, stereotypical stuff. And this idea of these two, white guys are going to do this story about Japan, he was kind of nervous about it. Like, oh, great, here we go, same old, some manga knockoff, whatever. And I sent him the outline and I sent him the first script. And then he was on board. And then he was like wickedly enthusiastic. And he basically said, I said, will you write one essay? And he said, don't let anyone write any essays. I'll take care of it. And he's been a great resource and a real enthusiastic supporter of what we're doing. And he doesn't generate the story, but he's very additive in the sense that we come up with what we're going to do. And then he reads stuff over and he then says, oh, we could do essays about this, or we could dig into more of the lore of that. Occasionally he'll say stuff like, did you know that this actually symbolically lines up really well with this historical thing or with this lore?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I'm like, yeah, that's the plan. And other times I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about. And he goes, well, that's a great coincidence because it just perfectly dovetails into this other thing. And so we've been able to use some of that quite, organically. And he and Steve will sort of jam back and forth about some of the katakana and the hiragana that you see on the signage in the background, or the names of characters or the names of some of the creatures or the way we use them in the book. You know what I mean? And people are always like, well, how accurate are you? And it's like any mythology, right? So the stories about unicorns, there are, dozens of stories about unicorns, and you could cherry pick certain bits and pieces, or vampires, for example. Like, well, how do you kill a vampire? Well, in this lore, it says this way, and in that lore, it says that way. And in these ones, they can go out in the daylight, but only with the clouds are out. And in the other one, they always sleep. And in the other one, they need, whatever. And the same kind of thing holds true with the yokai legends. There's a lot of diffused kind of information. So we're able to kind of cherry pick stuff and make it accurate to what we need it to be, or what works best for our story. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
To fill in the gaps where I say, well, it doesn't really say what they do here, so this works better for our story, or this is how we're going to represent that element of it, visually, or whatever you want to call it. And so we've got enough latitude that we can really kind of build off of it, but we've got this really great, just this incredible wealth of information and history that we can draw upon and build really cool stuff with.
Mm-hmm. Now, Steve is actually somebody that I have no idea how it's possible, but I never experienced his art before Wayward, and he is incredible. Like, I love his art so much.
I think what's bizarre is that he's been in the business longer than I have, and he's done work for DC and over the years and stuff like that. But he's never been like a big kind of breakout talent that people are like, oh, Steve Cummings. So to a lot of people, this is their first exposure to him.
Mm-hmm.
And to some of the people that have heard of him, they're like, oh, this is what he can do, when he's really cut loose and doing his own thing. And I think that's been just an amazing experience for him, being able to really dig in and do this passion project.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that, because I was talking, I had a podcast last week with Joe Kelly, and we were talking about Max Fiumara. And he was talking, like, I had no idea that Max had worked on Infinity Inc. at DC before. Right. And the first thing I'd ever read from him was Four Eyes, but apparently he'd done, I think like an X-Men book and other things like that, but he didn't stand out because I guess it wasn't a good fit. And maybe for Steve, that's the same thing. But
or even you do a book and it's just like, it's just different timing. The book, your book, it's good work, but there's all sorts of stuff coming out. It wasn't the hot book at the time or whatever, the nice thing about this is that it's exactly what he wants to be drawing. You know what I mean? And so we're able to, and with Creator Owned, the flexibility, particularly somewhere like Image, where we're our own boss in many ways, we can kind of really play to our strengths. And Steve and I can discuss this stuff and make changes based on what's working. Or, we have the overarching plan for the story, but enough flexibility that if something cool is happening we didn't expect, we can focus on that or we can adjust things. An example of that is at the end of the first story arc. In the original outline, it was pretty tepid. Like it was like pretty standard stuff. The group would fight the Nurion and the Kitsune, and they would escape, and then they would all kind of be together and on the run. And I thought, yeah, that's exactly what people would expect.
Right.
And then as I was sort of getting ready to write that issue, I thought, it feels a little too pat. I kind of want to blow up the building and have people are dead. And split the group and really throw things into turmoil so people are kind of waiting on pins and needles for a few months before we do the second arc. And I throw this idea out to Steve. I'm just like, hey, I'm going to blow up the building and screw up the team and, angst to the max. And he was like, great, I love it. Let's go. And I don't have to get approval from anyone else. I don't have to worry about anything else. We had one issue where I was like, man, this scene needs a couple extra pages to breathe because I feel like we packed in too much and it's hurting the storytelling. And he's like, I'll just two more pages. And I was like, okay. And we just did it. You know what I mean? And I love the ability to just do that, to just turn it on and say, this is what the book needs. This is what feels right.
Now I have to ask, was it by design that you worked with somebody who lives in Japan, or did it just kind of work out that you like, I want to work with Steve. Oh, you live in Japan. This is even better.
Well, the original idea for Wayward was not set in Japan.
Oh.
So weird, right? So
Yeah.
It seems so obvious now, but what was happening was Steve and I had previously, this is before Skullkickers even, we had worked together at the Udon studio. He was doing a bunch of freelance work for them. And he and I got along really well. And we worked on a bunch of, kind of creative services projects where I was the manager on it. And I like him and we got along well. And when I had traveled to Japan a couple times for work for Udon, we had met up with him there and gotten along really well. And, I said it'd be fun to work on a project like he and I. And he agreed. And then, people get busy and years go by, literally. And my whole life is changing. I launched Skullkickers, and all of a sudden, it's no longer like, geez, it'd be nice if I did some writing. It's like I'm considered a writer, and I'm starting to get freelance work. And he's watching my career kind of change. And he gets in touch with me and says, hey, look, remember we said we wanted to work together? Like, I've got a gap coming in my schedule. Do you want to do something? And, of course, I did. And so we just started kind of brainstorming back and forth what we could do. There had been a book that came out, the 10th anniversary of Udon, called it was called Vent, and it was like a bunch of pinups and tutorials from the artists at the studio. Most of them were their dream projects. Like, if I had my way, I'd do this. So Joe Ing does like a weird, I think it was like a post-apocalyptic military pinup thing, and some of the guys did like. Genzo, this artist from South America, he did a pinup that was all like a cowboy ghost story thing, and it was just like seeing people what their passions were instead of just the commercial work they'd done. And Steve did this piece of this girl with these two spiked bats and all these cats standing in front of these vending machines in Tokyo. And it was so evocative. It was so interesting. And I was like, that is cool. I said, what is this? And he goes, oh, I would love to do like a supernatural story set in Tokyo someday. And I was like, cool, man. And so years later, when we're talking about we're going to work together on something, I said, do you remember that piece you did in Vent in the art book? He said, yeah. I said, have you ever developed that? Have you done anything with it? No. Do you want to do something with that? And he's like, well, what do you think? And I was like, well, it's a supernatural story. Let's sort of go from there. And he told me a couple ideas he had about the girl with the cats. And I had this broader thematic idea about the way we view mythology in our modern lives. And it was in my head, I didn't have a setting for it. I just assumed it would be Eurocentric, because when you say mythology, everyone thinks like dragons and unicorns and whatever.
Right.
So Great Britain or whatever, Germany, but all of a sudden I realized that it didn't have to be Eurocentric mythology, and it could work just as well or better in a different location.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew some of the Japanese mythological stuff and the yokai stuff, but just in a broader sense. And so I started to do reading on that and digging in. And hilariously, one of the websites that I kept bookmarking stuff was Zach Davis. I didn't know that at the time. And I was pulling together all these notes and ideas. And Steve was totally into this stuff. And then it started to really tighten up. We had a thing we could play with. And I guess we were so excited, we didn't even think of the fact that it's kind of audacious, like these two Caucasian talk about Japan, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And the only parallel, and this sounds way cockier than I intended, right? So in my mind, it was like, you know, if Alan Moore can tell stories about Superman and the American dream, or Neil Gaiman can write about or different countries in Sandman or things like this, like if you're careful and sensitive, you can tell stories about other places, you know, and Steve's on the ground there. He lives in Yokohama, so he lives just outside of Tokyo. He's raising a family there. He knows the culture. He's living it. You know what I mean? And so we're going to really build this thing. And it just sort of took steam from there. And then it was like, okay, we've got this idea of these teenagers are going to be fighting monsters. How can we make them different and interesting? Come up with powers that kind of, they're not like just superpowers. Like we don't just have like, you know, elemental stuff or people flying or whatever, but how can we make them interesting and evocative within that setting and sort of the world building that goes into that. And so that's really how it took hold, was this kind of strange amalgamation of broader story ideas along with Steve's location and our mutual enthusiasm for the country.
Mm-hmm. I think, and this is the last thing I'm going to bring up to you, but I think one of the interesting things from rereading it, like, because I was buying it in single issues and then I ended up buying the trades in digital just because.
And we deeply appreciate the triple dip, let me tell you.
But, you know, honestly, like, as a person who's always bought single issues, the fact of the matter is it can be difficult to go and find those again so you can, like, research for podcasts. So having on my iPad is super nice. But rereading the first two arcs, I thought the introduction, the parallel in the introduction between Rory Lane and Ohara Emi, mm-hmm. I don't know if like that was like meant. I'm sure it was, but I don't know if it was meant for those to like parallel so similarly, like the way that they're introduced, their family lives.
Absolutely, that's by design.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it was really great reading that because it like naturally kind of paired them as, you know, these potentially opposite figures because their lives are so different, but also I don't know. I mean, I guess going forward, my biggest question is what their relationship is going to be now that they're partnered up and O'Hara's being like influenced by the spiders and everything. So I guess
it's even more complicated, right? Because spoilers, you know, Rory has wiped her parents' minds.
I know, God, that was
and
so nasty.
There's this intense drama bubbling underneath where not only have you been drafted into this war, but we've basically cut you off from your normal life. Like you are no longer able to even step away if you wanted to, kind of thing. And that is obviously has a role to play in the future. Someone was talking to me about Wayward when I was in New York, and they said, you know, this one kid, like, kind of, he's eating the souls of the dead and the spirits, and the one girl is like kind of messing with destiny, and mm-hmm. the other girl's like kind of a murdering like cat psycho.
Yeah,
like these are not heroic figures per se. And I'm like, well, one of the things I try and avoid the term hero, because I don't think that they're necessarily heroes. I don't think they're bad guys, but I don't think those roles are clean cut, right? Mm-hmm. They're teenagers, and they have these difficulties, and there's obviously people hunting them in unbelievable amounts of difficulty in their lives, and they're reacting to it. One of the most difficult things about writing the story is the fact that the vast majority of the time in these first two arcs, our protagonists are reactive. Mm-hmm. They are on the wrong side of the conflict. They're being hunted. These other people have way more knowledge than they do. They are on the run and on the defensive almost the entire time. and trying to make it feel like there's a cohesive movement forward when your characters are basically getting battered and hunted almost the entire time was a challenge. But that felt like a more valid story than just having these characters know everything, kind of monster of the week sort of feel.
Yeah. Well, and I think, I always think of like good guys and bad guys as like a matter of perspective. And it's
boy, and in the third story arc, that is going to be readily apparent.
Yeah. And it is interesting though, because it's like, I kind of like after reading the second arc, I was just kind of like, especially reading it again and seeing that parallel between O'Hara and Rory, it's like, I kind of feel like O'Hara might be like the good guy relative to everybody else, but it's gonna be interesting to see that play out, especially given that I don't know, like it's easy to root against the dude who's wearing like the barbershop quartet hat, but
it's funny too because and again, this is all really built into the structure of it. When Rory's looking at the world, she's got a certain perspective on things and she's glossing over certain elements of Japanese culture or the conflict because she doesn't see some of the nuance.
Mm-hmm.
And O'Hara sees more of the Japan kind of end of things because she's grown up in it.
Right.
But she doesn't have certain perceptions outside of her own kind of microcosm of this is what a loyal, good Japanese girl is supposed to do. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And the perspective shifts again in the third arc. So we're going to get another character's perspective on this conflict and how it's changing them. And I'm really excited for people to see that because like we did with issue 6 where we switched from Rory to O'Hara, people were shocked. Like, you can't do that. You can't take your main character and kind of sideline them. But it worked, and we were able to bring kind of a different perspective to the series. And I think, validly so. And I hope we're able to continue doing that, where we can broaden this cast. The book is not called Rory's Story. It's called, Wayward, and it's about this group, and it's about these people, and it's about this event that is taking place. Mm-hmm. And I think that is going to become more apparent as the series goes on. I don't want to, claim, delusions of grandeur, right? But when you watch Game of Thrones and they're moving between these locations and they're showing you these characters and you're rooting for some of them or you wonder what's going to happen next, in that way, not that I'm saying we're Game of Thrones, but there are going to be pockets of things happening and pieces moving on the board, and I'm hoping that we're able to keep them all engaging and entertaining for people.
Well, you guys have succeeded so far. I've been really enjoying it, and I'm looking forward to seeing what's next. But thank you so much for coming on, Jim.
My absolute pleasure. It's nice to be able to chat about some of the stuff and to be, pretty honest about, what's working and what's not working. And I think that that's valuable, keep my swelled head in order, but also just to understand that, that this creative business is a roller coaster ride, and it is a really fun one, and it's something I deeply love. But it has challenges, and I'm learning so much every single year. And if I wasn't, I think I would be disappointed. I want to know more next year than I did, the year before.
Mm-hmm.
I want to keep expanding my horizons that way, and so I'm thankful that people are supportive of the work. And that they're enthusiastic about what I'm doing. It makes all the difference.
Mm-hmm. Well, you got to keep writing those blogs, though. Somehow you're going to have to, I think you need a clone or something.
Yeah, I know. It's great.
That would probably be ideal. But again, thank you so much. And looking forward to, everything that's coming next, which is a lot.
Thanks, man. My absolute pleasure. I've got a new creator-owned book. Now that Skullkickers is done, I've got a new creator-owned project that I'm developing. As of New York, I've attached it at a publisher, so it's happening for sure in 2016. I'm not going to go into any more detail than that, but I'm unbelievably excited about it, and I think it's going to show people on the other side of my work, and I'm just really pumped. So Wayward comes first, but alongside that, I've got more stuff brewing, so good times ahead.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel from Sketch.com.
You can find this week's guest, Jim Zub, on Twitter at Jim Zub and on the web at jimzub.com. You can find the blogs we talked about on his site and his work in Wayward, Figment, Skullkickers, and more. You can find more sketch content at Sketched, that's sktchd.com. Follow us on Twitter at sketchcomic and like us on Facebook at /sketched. Thanks for listening and tune in next week for another episode.